My question is about appreciation.
You wouldn't even know what love and appreciation is if you didn't know what the opposite of it was. So you don't want to condemn the opposite of what you want, because what you want couldn't be if the opposite couldn't be. So if you are predominantly feeling good, then doesn't the not feeling good keep you knowing? In other words, isn't there a sharpening in that focus? Don't you want to be able to focus? You get to set your own standards, and what happens is, once you accept the validity of this vortex, this vibrational reality, and once you feel how it feels to be in it and not, and in it and not, and in it and not, and by the way, it keeps moving because life keeps taking you into higher and higher vibrations. So rather than trying to figure out what percentage of the time you're in it or what percentage of the time you're not in it, just set your intention to feel as good as you can possibly feel. And what you'll begin to discover is you cannot think an out of the vortex thought and an in the vortex thought at the same time. You're just not doing it. You're either your vibration is where it is, and if your vibration is high and then you change the subject, you're going to feel a drop, and that's what you were describing. Or if your vibration is low and you change the subject, you can feel the uptake of it too. In other words, show yourself that you have the ability to focus yourself into alignment with who you are, and then just practice it, practice it, practice it, practice it. And most of all, don't ever get down on yourself for focusing out of the vortex. It's all right. It's a step one moment. Just don't make a career out of step one.